myself. My name is Miguel Escobar, and I serve as Managing Program Director of Leadership and External Affairs at the Episcopal Church Foundation. And I want to welcome everyone who's joining us tonight on Facebook Live, as well as those who registered and are joining us in the Zoom conference room. And I would like to welcome tonight's guest, Kyle Oliver. Before we begin, I just want to give a little advertisement about ECF, or share a few words about what ECF is. We're a lay-led independent organization whose mission is to strengthen the strategic, leadership, and financial capabilities of Episcopal congregations, dioceses, and other agencies of the church. And we do this in a wide variety of ways. We have a lot of different programs. But one of the longest lasting programs, in fact, the longest lasting program, is the Fellowship Partners Program, which has been around since 1964. Since then, ECF has been identifying scholars and ministry leaders whose work is laying the groundwork for the next generation of leaders in the church. And that really brings us to the work of Kyle. In 2016, Kyle received an ECF fellowship for his work in digital ministry. And Kyle, do you want to just say a few words about where you are currently?
Sure. Yeah. So I am a doctoral student in the Communications, Media, and Learning Technologies Design program at Teachers College at Columbia University. And previously, I was the digital missioner in the Center for the Ministry of Teaching at Virginia Theological Seminary.
Great, thank you. This is a short event. Basically, it's a 30-minute Q&A, and so I want us to kind of jump right in immediately. I have a list of questions. Some of them are mine. Some of them are from people who've written in ahead of time, sent us emails. But if you're attending this event, whether on Facebook Live or in the Zoom conference room, I'd encourage you to send in your questions in Zoom using the chat function, and on Facebook, just simply enter a comment underneath the Facebook Live video that you are watching. So why don't we just jump in with one of the kind of a pretty basic question. You, Kyle, talk about leveraging technology to form faith, share the gospel, organize action, and be disciples in our digital age. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about what you mean about that.
Yeah, well, I use that phrase partly because I think the way that most of us think about technology is first and foremost as a tool, a tool we can leverage, a tool we can use. And so lots of new media technology has terrific uses for the church to do those various sorts of ministry, right? To witness, to provide care, to do various kinds of teaching, etc. So I use that language. Because that's, I think, the first thing we think about with technology. What I want to go to from there is to point out this notion that won't be new to a lot of folks, that these technology are also spaces. They're also, they're not just tools for ministry, they're sites of ministry. And so even though I use that phrase, I also want to push beyond it and say that all of the roles that the church has always played in our culture and for individuals, those kinds of roles can also play themselves out in these new media spaces, places like Facebook or any number of other places.
Great. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you can also share some examples of congregations or the kinds of things that congregations are doing in digital ministry that are working particularly well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, let me share a couple of lower tech ideas and maybe a couple of higher tech ideas. I think on the lower tech side, I think doing things as basic as parceling out a monthly paper newsletter into weekly stories for an email newsletter of updates each week. Yeah, even for people who are reading that paper newsletter, having a little extra, nudge when somebody shares one of those stories that maybe I skipped and it shows up in my inbox on Friday morning. That's a great thing. I've been amazed at seeing people walk into churches I've served who haven't been there in a very, very long time. Sometimes to an event that I wouldn't expect someone of that level of engagement to show up to. And I said, how did you hear about this? And they said, oh, well, we get the emails. We saw there was going to be this event and it worked on our calendar, so we came. So that's a sort of straightforward kind of low tech example. A higher tech example might be, there are a number of congregations who are experimenting with the same technology we're using now, Facebook Live, to offer all kinds of prayer and presence. So I know of some congregations who are doing sort of, a colleague of mine is calling them pop-up prayers. So that's an opportunity for sort of video-based prayer on a sort of spontaneous basis. I know of a congregation that does much more predictable, regular, and fairly traditional morning prayer service via Facebook Live as well. So those are just a few. There's so many we could list, but these tools give us the chance to extend the things that we're already good at into these new spaces. And the challenge is to think about how do we do that translation in a way that works well in the new medium.
Yeah. In our previous conversations, you mentioned one congregation, or at least one priest, who does something like Facebook Live office hours, or perhaps Skype office hours. What are
Yeah,
you
it
more
was
about?
sure. It was Periscope, actually,
Okay.
another live video tool owned by Twitter. And I don't think he's doing it anymore, but yeah, so he was doing office hours, and the caption or whatever was "Ask a Priest." And they were really, really engaging sessions. I guess it's not inappropriate for me to say this is a seminary classmate of mine named Phil Duvall, who was he's just like a really smart, funny, engaging guy, and he would start these sessions, and people would just pop in. I think because they were curious at the notion of like popping in to ask a priest questions. And he took all kinds of questions from a very multi-faith audience, equal, as I said, equal parts, sort of humor and wit and caring. It was a really good medium for him, just the right level of firmness and thoughtfulness, and a really interesting and I think really sort of church non-traditional sort of audience. I think lots of the folks popping in for Ask a Priest office hours were not necessarily in a congregation most Sunday mornings. It was just an example of somebody whose personality worked really well with a particular medium, and he found a great format and built a great audience. There's not a lot of faith-related media that I engage after work, but if I saw that Phil was coming on to do office hours and I was at the gym, I would switch over my phone and watch Phil answer questions about faith.
That sounds amazing. What are some of the factors that are leading congregations and clergy and other faith leaders to explore digital ministry as an option?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a whole range of things. As with lots of new practices, sometimes the reasoning isn't always super well thought out, or super sort of optimistic necessarily. Like there is a tendency, and I totally understand this, and it's not entirely wrong, to say things aren't working for us. We're really struggling. We're not getting new people, etc. We better try something new. Uh, we don't see a lot of young people here. We have the sense that maybe young people are using this technology more, so we better, we better do this kind of thing. And that's, I think, not entirely wrong-headed. I do think that these tools give us a chance to potentially connect with people who would not spontaneously enter a church building under most circumstances, and that really is an exciting opportunity. It does mean that we have to be thoughtful about what kinds of messages and formats and engagement modes we come up with, and they might look quite different from our usual. So, I mean, to be honest, positive or negative versions of that, certainly high on the list of factors, but I think also a real gospel imperative to want to, I'm an alum of Virginia Seminary, and the words on the chapel, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel. I mean, I think that there's some of that too, this acknowledgement that these are spaces and we ought to be present, pastorally present, missionally present, evangelistically present, whatever, again, all the ways of being church that we, have always had, we ought to bring them to bear on these new spaces in authentic ways.
Do you think that time and limited schedules is coming into play in terms of maybe encouraging, if not more than just encouraging, in congregations to explore sort of alternatives to their faith formation models?
Yeah, definitely. There's a good example. A former colleague of ours. I always go back and forth on whether to name congregations. I didn't in our rehearsal, but my colleague Dave Smith Pritchard did some really nice work building a hybrid faith formation program in the congregation she was serving in Metro Washington, and that was very much in response to a stated need on behalf of the people of her congregation. This is a parish with a lot of young families, and they said, "We love worship. We're fed by worship. We want to be at worship almost every week. We try really hard to get here, and we're so glad to be here." And doing that is about all we can do in terms of, we're inside the DC Beltway. We've got tons of things going on. Sunday morning is our only chance for family time. And so that extra hour for faith formation hour, we're experiencing as a real hardship. It's not that we don't want it. It's just that there's so many goods in conflict here, and something has to give. So rather than all of us sort of busting our butts trying to make a formation hour happen every single week, what if we did some formation in our homes in a way that can be supplemented with online material during the week, most weeks, and then once a month gather for a real sort of blowout faith formation hour with food, or more than an hour, with food and fellowship and games and teaching, and really sort of go all out, and we'll have a little more energy from not trying to keep the Sunday school machine running, and it will also give us the ability to spend a little more attention on supporting faith practice at home, which there's good research to suggest is where the real dividends are to be had anyway. That actually faith practice in the home is actually quite a bit more important potentially than at church, in terms of the sort of stickiness of faith for the people that we're for the young people we're raising.
Yeah. So the argument that I'm hearing is that using technology allows us to do faith formation in a space that people are already in, which is online as well. maybe to do formation at home. Um, I'm sure you're familiar with the counter argument, which is that a lot is lost in not having people physically present with one another.
Mhm.
And I've heard the argument being that using technology in this way is almost anti-incarnational uh,
Mhm.
in more
Mhm.
ways. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to that argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something, I think it's a good question and a good point that we need to grapple with. This notion of, especially for Anglicans, the doctrine of the incarnation, that, Jesus, the word was made flesh and dwelt among us, is central to our particular way of believing. And, to that, I would want to say that I think we actually narrow the scope of that doctrine, that we sort of sell the incarnation short if we talk about it in a way that is solely about bodies and flesh and not also about culture and society and wider interpersonal structures in a way that isn't only linked to the fact that I'm a body and you're a body. Jesus had a body, but Jesus also had a culture. Jesus was part of a society, and he communicated in and with members of that society in really savvy and effective ways. And I think that Jesus had a culture and was part of a human family in a broader way is also an incarnational notion. And so if sociologists and anthropologists are telling us that digital mediation is part of the fabric of our social structures today, then maybe engaging in those ways is actually an incarnational thing to do. If you want to hear a version of this argument, Keith Anderson lays it out pretty nicely, I think, in his book, The Digital Cathedral, and talks about the opportunities for deeply incarnational ministry, both in person and online, that happens when we're present in authentic ways in online spaces. So, I mean, to that, general criticism, I say, in some sense, a hearty amen, and in another sense, but can you think broader? Can you think wider about this? And I also think that the truth is that what's happening here right now is in some sense an incarnational sort of act, right? Like, you are not a disembodied voice to me. I see your face, and I've been on calls where I've seen people who haven't seen each other in months, who might be separated by entire continents and oceans, enter a digital room like this and just light up in a way that is surely of the incarnation, despite the fact that they weren't quite able to give each other a hug.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice segue for a question we received from our audience, which was about doing things like live streaming sermons as kind of a digital ministry for homebound people. Um, are there any sort of recommendations or practices that you would recommend for kind of taking worship, I guess, into the home?
Yeah. Well, I think there are. The first thing I'd want to say is there are lots of ways to do it, and it doesn't all have to be sort of full out. I wouldn't try to go from 0 to 60. If there is sort of no aspect of your worship being captured right now, the thought of, okay, well, let's install cameras and let's get someone to run the live event, and let's train our folks who can't be with us for whatever reason to connect using whatever tools are appropriate for the medium. That's a big leap, and it actually it takes quite a bit of infrastructure to really do that well. If the goal is something like, creating a high quality broadcast of your worship, and not for nothing, the copyright challenges are not insignificant. Um, but for instance, could you make sure that a recording of your sermons were definitely online? It's a very personal part of the service. It connects the people who can't be with the congregation, with a lot of the themes that they're chewing on in a particular moment, and that you can do with fairly little infrastructure. I mean, I at times have recorded my sermons right from the pulpit, on my smartphone, press record while people are sitting down, and it's there, and there are lots of relatively cheap or almost free ways of getting those recordings available to people. And for people who would like them and don't necessarily have fast internet access, or aren't super savvy about technology, I knew a congregation that would record parts of the service and then bring them to homebound folks on iPods. Like, press play, press pause. That's all you have to do. There is one file on this thing, and it is the recording from our service last week. I think that's lovely and a really nice idea. My early years of discerning a call to ordained ministry were deeply shaped by the media ministry, if we want to call it that, of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. I listened to what now seems to me like a completely absurd amount of sermons while out on many runs in that year before I headed to seminary. And it was incredibly meaningful to me and to several of the people that I worshiped with. And so don't underestimate the impact that can have, but also don't underestimate the amount of work that it is. Start slow, find things that allow you to sort of put your best foot forward and a meaningful foot forward. And if it starts to take off a bit, maybe try to take some further steps.
Yeah, great. Just a quick follow-up question. Do the people at Grace Cathedral know that was so impactful for you?
That's a good question. I mean, it was I have a friend of mine is on the staff there now, and I've certainly told him.
Okay.
The dean who was there at the time is no longer there. But they were one of the first congregations that I know of that were doing a ministry like this, and I think have been thoroughly and properly thanked by lots of folks. But I should reach out. That's a good call.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you see as a common mistake that congregations make when trying to do this? I mean, you mentioned kind of going from 0 to 100 in trying to go from 0 to 100. What are some other mistakes?
Yeah. Well, I don't mean this in a sort of glib meta way, but in some ways, maybe the most common mistake is like being a little too worried about mistakes. I think a lot of us, and I'll include myself here, like that there is a limit to how much damage one can do by making a mistake, a communications mistake, for instance, in person. And in theory, the theoretical limit for the scope of that mistake and its consequences could be a lot higher online. I mean, there's no doubt that that's just, the case. However, the likelihood of that is quite low. And the reality is that if anything, the opposite problem is usually true, which is that we could be making loads of mistakes and like no one is seeing it anyway. So, I think that the biggest mistake is not to dive in and try some things and to be deterred for fear of failing. I guess continuing down that line of inquiry, not then trying to learn from those mistakes and course correct, and have the mistakes and their consequences be data points for charting a path forward, I think is a missed opportunity. And then that goes in the positive direction too. I mean, I think one of the real blessings of all of these tools is the fact that there's just all kinds of feedback mechanisms built in. I mostly for personal edification have been posting on a little website that I made a daily multimedia prayer prompt weekdays. And sometimes the prayer that I think was just beautiful and perfectly crafted and really wonderful just goes over like a lead balloon. And sometimes something that I thought was just a silly one-off, why would anyone be interested in that, takes off, gets shared, some generates lots of discussion and conversation and thank yous. And any isolated example in either direction is not destiny. But as you accumulate some experience, you get the sense for what kinds of content or what ways of reaching out, or whatever you're trying to make decisions about, which ones work and which ones don't in general. If you stick with it long enough, you should, through the responses of people you're engaging with, be able to kind of read those. I was going to say read the tea leaves, but it's not like reading tea leaves. It's much more straightforward than that.
Yeah.
And
Read analytics.
yeah, exactly. So those are both some mistakes and some ways around them, I suppose.
I will say one, as someone who likes technology, obviously, one of the challenges that I personally face, and I think I see a lot of uh, congregational leaders facing, is choosing among the different tools. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
because there are so many different ones out there. You've already
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, I think, Periscope, which honestly I'd never heard of even.
Sure,
I mean, there
sure.
are just so many that are out there. Any recommendations for selecting, one
Mm-hmm.
to focus on?
Yeah. I mean, I think the big questions to think about are, who are you trying to reach? Um, and and where are they? Um, who are your current people? In whatever way you're defining that, it might be that you want to reach an entirely new audience, but chances are that's going to be a little more of a stretch and a challenge for you
Mm,
than reaching more people like the people you currently reach. So sub question there, where are your people already? What platforms are your people using? Where are you getting the most connection invitations from the people you serve, etc. So who are you trying to reach? Where are your people already? And then what sorts of what medium or mediums are especially well attuned to your goals, or to say it a little less sort of clinically and instrumentally, to your person, right? I mean, the only reason I'm getting on Periscope while I'm on the treadmill is because a guy I like who's funny and interesting and smart is saying funny, smart, interesting things on Periscope. And it's just like it was just this perfect match of role, goal, person, medium. And I think as you get familiar with the tools that are out there and what you want to do and who you want to do it with, those matches will start to become clear. It's worth saying that Facebook is where the most people are, period, and so it's definitely worth some attention.
mm,
uh,
yeah.
and email isn't dead. The biggest
Yeah.
mistake I've made in my work and ministry in this space is not thinking early enough about maintaining good email lists.
Mm, okay. Great. So it's 7:59, and I want to honor the fact that we're ending at 8. Two thoughts. First is I'd love for you to share your contact information or anyone who has further questions. They can send those directly to you. And then maybe a future-oriented, hopeful question here. Wondering if you could talk about any technologies that you see on the horizon that you think are particularly interesting for people engaged in faith formation.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Well, contact information wise, probably the easiest one to just hear and process in this format is you can reach me at kyle@kyleoliver.net. So I may not reply from that, but that's probably the easiest thing to just remember, to send me an email. I'm KM Oliver on Twitter, which is sort of my favorite place to hang out. And if you don't mind me saying, that little prayer site I mentioned is at creativecommonsprayer.com. A hopeful thing for me, or something kind of looking ahead. It's really just a plea. Like, let's not freak out about virtual reality. I am at a premier school of education, research university, and the amount of money being poured into virtual reality right now is kind of staggering. There's no doubt in my mind that virtual reality is going to be a bigger part of some of our everyday lives in the less distant than we think future. And let's not freak out the same way we freaked out about everything else. Let's trust that there are going to be some opportunities and some potential pitfalls, some things that we have to encourage people to use some restraint about, and some things that we can just sort of rejoice in the delight of what human ingenuity has made possible. There's going to be some really cool things, and some of them the church, I think, can really benefit from and maybe be a part of in powerful ways. So I guess that's my forward-looking advice.
Yeah, that's a great point. And thank you for your plea. I'll bear that in mind. As someone who is a little nervous, I will say.
If anyone is soliciting think pieces, I suppose we have to call it, I'd love to write that one.
Yeah.
Send me an email.
Well, thank you so much, Kyle. And again, to everyone who's joined us in Zoom and on Facebook Live, there's some wonderful comments, a lot of hellos from Kyle. Please check those out.
I will.
Just again, thank you. And for those attending, ECF is going to be doing more of these in the future. These short or really short 30-minute Q&As with thought leaders and fellows from across the church. And we hope you will join again. Thank you so much, and have a good night.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Miguel.